To make the most of the days that you have this coming year, you don't need another productivity hack. You need clearer boundaries between your work and your rest. And these clear boundaries actually date all the way back to the first 2 books of the Bible. Hustle culture tells you one set of lies, that you need to constantly be working, that you should never sleep, that the grind never stops. And at the same time, there's a culture of entitlement and distraction that tells you, hey, treat yourself. You got another notification, maybe it's something interesting, maybe you should do that instead of doing the work that you're actually supposed to be doing. Between these 2 sets of lies, we end up doing half-hearted work where we're anxious and distracted and pretty stinking inefficient. And then when it's our time off and we're supposed to go rest, we end up not actually resting. Instead, we're just numbing ourselves and we feel more exhausted when it's time to go back to work. So we don't find the joy that we're able to find in the work that we have, and we're never actually restored by our times of rest where we should be. And from the very beginning, God had a better plan. About a week ago, I told one of my friends about this album that I released. Actually, it was a couple albums that I released last year. I recorded a few things just using my home equipment. And I was like, oh, you should check it out. I'm not sure it's your cup of tea, but why don't you check it out? And he laughed, and his response was, where do you find the time to do these things? And that's actually a pretty common thing that people say to me because, I have my day job where I teach at a school and I also preach on the weekends at a church. And then I also make these fun music videos with my family where it's like a Spanish education channel. And I make these videos and I play some music. And in the middle of all that, I'm also trying to raise kids and be a decent husband. And you have to wash the car. And actually, we don't wash our car, but I do have to vacuum the floors and we have to take out the trash and do all that type of stuff. And I found that I do have time to do all of these things and do them pretty well. And it's not because there's anything necessarily special about me. And in fact, I'm not actually super great all the time at doing all of those things. Sometimes one of those things ends up struggling or not being as great as they can be. But I found that the closer I stick to God's plan, the one from the beginning that I've already alluded to, it seems like I end up having more time in my day than other people. Almost like I've been given more hours than everybody else. And it's because of this principle in Exodus 20. Here's what it says in Exodus 20. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. And we actually see this mentioned even earlier on in Genesis chapter 2. Now, it's not in command form. And to be honest, the Exodus 21 is not actually in command form. Technically, it's an indicative form, but it's in the context where we take it imperatively. So he's saying, this is what you are going to do. This is how it's supposed to be. It's in the indicative, but we take it as the imperative, aka a command. But that's neither here nor there. In Genesis chapter 2, we get the first inclination of this pattern that's already been set up because God creates everything in the heavens and the earth in those 6 days of creation. And on the 7th day, the God that has infinite resources, infinite power, infinite ability to continue creating and doing amazing new things, God rests on the 7th day. God stops producing for a second to take in and delight in the good, beautiful thing that he's created. So from both the original creation account and Exodus 20, we have a clear indication that our weeks are to be broken up in 7 discrete units. 6 of those units are to be used for labor. In fact, this is what it says, 6 days you shall labor. One of those units is for rest. You shall rest. It's not a make sure that there's a little bit of rest and a little bit of labor. No, there is a set amount of time that you are supposed to work and a set amount of time that you are supposed to rest. 83.3% of your days are for work, and 16.7% of your days are for rest. But that's not the norm. I think you can see yourself in some of the stats that we see in today's society. In fact, some of these things are things that I see myself doing, and when I fall into the trap feeling unrestored by my rest or feeling unproductive in the things that I'm able to create and do in the time that I have to work, I find that it's me falling into these traps that are represented in these statistics. The site Workamajig, I love that name, that's fun, did a little bit of research. It surveyed 1,600 employees, and so I know the sample size isn't super huge, but I think their findings resonate with my experience and I think a lot of other people's experience. They said that an average of 6 hours and 33 minutes a week are lost to distraction at work. That means after a month of work time, there's over 26 hours of work time that is lost. I hear people say things like, oh, there's just not enough time in the day, or I wish I had an extra day. Literally, the amount of time that is spent on distraction is more than a day in each month. It's like you get an extra day. It's your 32nd day of the month. I guess depending on the month, it might be 30th or 31st or the 29th if it's February. But we lose a full day on distraction. In their same research, they said that 90% of US workers are distracted once daily, and about 25% of these workers are distracted up to 6 times a day. Now, in my own personal experience, I actually feel like this is kind of generous. Maybe it was based off of self-reporting, I'm sure, and so because of that, no one's going to want to confess how distracted they actually are. There's a different article that I found in Forbes, and in their research, they found that the average person works only 3 minutes at a time before getting distracted. Distraction, it could be the phone, it could be the notification that pops up, it's the ding or the bleep or the bloop that comes up on their computer, it could be an email, it could be a coworker coming up, it could be any number of things, but 3 minutes and then they're distracted. Now you might be like, okay, yeah, but then they pick up right away and go back to work, don't they? But in that same article, they talked about how it takes an average of 23 minutes for that distracted person to return to the original task. And almost a quarter of people don't even return to that task until the next day. Now, I don't think we necessarily need articles to prove the fact that we are distracted and probably inefficient in the things that we are supposed to be doing throughout the day. Whether you're working for someone or you work from home or you're a stay-at-home mom or whatever your walk of life is, I know that we all struggle with thinking, I thought I could get more done. In fact, my old boss in this old job that I had back when I was working in manual labor, he said he's happy if he can get the guys that I was working with to work at least 70% of the time. 70% he considered a huge win. That's like great boss work if he can only have them wasting 30% of their time that they're supposed to be paid for stuff. So think about your life. Are you part of these stats? I know that I am part of these stats, definitely sometimes. And if we find ourselves in these stats, that means that those 83.3% of our days that we are supposed to spend doing labor, 6 days you shall labor, once we consider the number of distractions, the number of times that the distraction pulls us away from the task and then the task gets left aside or forgotten until the next day. Obviously, there's no real mathematical calculation that we can do to be like, okay, you had 83.3% of your days and now you're only spending like 22.6532. But I think we can all agree that it's significantly reduced. And so in the first part of that command, the fourth commandment in the Big Ten, what if you gave your 100%? What if you gave your full energy and attention to the work that you put your hands to? Those 6 days of the week, you dedicate yourself to the creative work that God put in your heart, to the things that God wants you to build in this world. See, there's no such thing as jobs that are unimportant or that God doesn't care about. Think about it. Even if you work in business, what you are doing in business is you are part of figuring out how resources get into different places into the world, how they exchange hands with one another. A simple transaction at a store, essentially saying, hey, how do we get these things that are over here to other people over there? If you're in customer service, you get to be the face of human connection for another human being. If you are a teacher, you're educating future minds. If you are a parent, you are raising up the next generation. What if we poured our 100% into the work that we have set before us? Now, naturally, if we just continue to grind, if we continue to do that 100%, we burn out. I've been the victim. I guess I'm not a victim if I'm doing it to myself. I have experienced the heaviness of burnout before because of trying to just go 100% all the time, which is why, again, God is really smart. And he said, no, we are going to program intentional rest time into each week. When I talk to people, there's the default question of, hey, how you doing? And one of the most common responses that I find that I'm getting, and I think this is actually kind of across the board, is either tired or busy. And I think that's a symptom of what a lot of us are experiencing because we aren't actually resting. We aren't actually getting restored by our time off. When we have downtime, when we're supposed to be renewed and restored, we aren't. We take our phones to bed, which we know delays the onset of sleep, especially if you're scrolling through social media. You're less likely to go to sleep right away because you're continuing to get those dopamine hits. Why would you put that thing down? And because we have these supercomputers in our pockets and screens in our living rooms and all sorts of activities and things that we're supposed to run off to in our free leisurely time, we are incredibly fragmented and distracted. There's actually a condition. There's some debate about whether or not it's like a legitimate condition called directed attention fatigue, which is essentially this, that we are fighting so often against distraction that our executive functioning and all sorts of things in our cognitive processing is significantly reduced. Our capacity to do the work that we need to do is reduced because we're constantly fending off distraction. And all of that distraction infuses our rest time so that when we are trying to intentionally refuel, we can't. We're still draining the battery with all the distraction. We think we're resting when we're laying there on the couch scrolling through our social media feed, but if you've done any amount of doom scrolling, you know that you don't feel better after you've done that for a while. In fact, in Genesis 2, it says that the Sabbath, God called it blessed and holy. And I don't know about you, but after scrolling for an hour consuming short form content, I don't necessarily feel like that's a super blessed and holy experience. And since we aren't actually resting those 16.7% of the days of our week, we go back to work feeling fatigued, exhausted, drained. So often my students come back from their weekend. I'm like, all right, you ready to learn? They're like, no, I'm exhausted. I'm like, you're exhausted. You just had 2 days off where you were supposed to be refreshed and restored. But we all know that if they're doing things that aren't actually refreshing and restoring them, then they're going to come back drained. Now, we can talk for ages about what the Sabbath is supposed to be. There are books written just on Sabbath and how Sabbath works and how getting this type of rest is supposed to function and what is God's intent and plan for Sabbath and how do we as modern day Christians live this thing out. And I mean, full disclosure, I am a Christian, and so I obviously see a little bit differently than our Jewish friends, but nevertheless, I don't think we throw out this concept just because it originated in the Old Testament. Even though Jesus raised a ruckus sometimes when it came to his application of Sabbath law, but he didn't throw out the Sabbath. He said that the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath, but he doesn't say, so therefore there's no more Sabbath. He's like, no, the Sabbath is a good thing for you as human beings, for us as human beings, and so we better not throw this thing out because it's made for us. It's for our own good because God actually cares about us. And when we look across scripture and the teachings throughout the years, what we see is that Sabbath is supposed to include delight in God's good creation, just like God did in Genesis chapter 2. It's supposed to be a time for relational connection, which is why we go to church gatherings oftentimes once a week to really connect with other human beings, but it's also relational connection between us and God. It's time to dedicate ourselves to thinking, okay, we are not just human doings, we are human beings, and we are meant to connect with other human beings. We're supposed to relate with one another. And as we connect with people, and as we delight in God's creation, it's also a time to pause from productivity. We were created in God's image to create, but we are also created in God's image to delight and rest, just like he did in Genesis chapter 2. Now, I know there's all sorts of nuance to this, that we can't just have like a new set of rigid rules and then, oh, you should beat yourself up because you didn't rest properly or because you're not hustling properly. There are different seasons of life. We're trying to raise kids here and pay insurance bills and maintain houses and apartments, and we have to make dinner and we have to exercise, and there's all of these other ingredients, right? It's not just 100% work and 100% rest. I mean, we also have to sleep during the day. There's all of these other considerations. However, I do think our lives, or I can at least say my life, looks differently when on the days where I'm supposed to be working, I pour my full self into the work that has been put in front of me, to the creative dreams that God has put in my mind and in my heart to produce and make in this world. When I give it my 100%, one, I'm ready to rest at the end of the week. But two, I find that there's all of these hours in the day that I didn't know I had access to when I was distracted. And when I fully rest, when I take time to actually delight in the goodness of being alive and God's creation and the goodness of relationships and the goodness of connection with God, when I actually have that time to rest, I find that by the end of a full day of doing that type of rest, I'm itching to get back to creating. I'm itching to get back to doing something meaningful and productive with my hands. So this year, there's going to be time for rest and there's going to be time for work. What would it look like if we honored God's command and honored both the 83.3% and the 16.7%? That we were all in when it was time to rest and we were all in when it's time to work. I think you'll be surprised at what God is able to accomplish through you this year. Heck, maybe even this month.